Amid the rolling hills of Latium, where the Tiber meanders silently, one of the most powerful and influential military institutions in the history of humanity was born, the Roman legion. In the distant 6th century before Christ, when Rome was still a small city-state under the rule of the Etruscan kings, the embryo of what would become the most feared army of antiquity was germinating. In that archaic time, military service was not a career, but an inalienable duty of every Roman citizen who owned land. The defense of the city and the fertile fields that ensured its subsistence depended directly on the mobilization of its inhabitants, who formed a rudimentary civic militia, summoned to repel invaders or slowly expand the domains of the nascent city. The influence of neighboring civilizations was decisive in this initial process. The Etruscans, masters of engineering and social organization, provided not only construction and administrative techniques, but also military models that Rome adapted to its own reality. Likewise, contact with the Greek police of the southern Italian peninsula, Magna Graecia, brought knowledge about combat tactics and weaponry, which gradually integrated into the Roman arsenal. However, in this embryonic period, the Roman army lacked the complexity and discipline that would later make it invincible. It was, above all, a reflection of the agrarian and aristocratic society of monarchical Rome. With the overthrow of the monarchy and the advent of the Republic at the end of the 6th century before Christ, the need for a more effective and permanent military structure became evident. Rome, now governed by elected magistrates and the Senate, faced constant conflicts with neighboring peoples, Sabines, Volsci, Etruscans, and Latins. The still modest territorial expansion required not only temporary soldiers, but a military body that could be mobilized frequently and efficiently. Thus the centurial system emerged, organizing citizens into classes based on their wealth and their ability to provide their own armament, strongly linking political participation to military contribution. At this stage, the Roman legion assumed an eminently civic and egalitarian character. Soldiers, known as hoplites, fought side by side, equipped with spears, helmets, and round shields, inspired by the Greek phalanx. Cohesion and discipline were still limited, but the seed of the meticulous organization that would later characterize the legion began to sprout. The annual conscription of soldiers by the consul and the formation of specific contingents for each campaign indicated progressive advancement in the institutionalization of the army. The process of transforming the Roman armed forces continued throughout the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, driven by the need to resist external threats and consolidate territorial conquests. The experience gained in wars against the Etruscans and Gauls, which culminated in the traumatic sack of Rome by the Senones in the year 390 before Christ, provoked a profound reflection on the effectiveness of the Republic's military institutions. It was in this context of crisis and learning that the Roman legion began to distance itself from the hoplite model and seek its own identity, more flexible, adaptable, and cohesive. Throughout these early centuries, the spirit that would define the Roman legion was forged. The combination of iron discipline, tactical ingenuity, and the ability to absorb and improve upon the most effective aspects of the military traditions of the peoples with whom Rome waged war or established alliances. The origins of the legion, therefore, are a complex synthesis of tradition and innovation, pragmatism and idealism, reflecting the very essence of Roman civilization, resilient, expansionist, and deeply aware of its historical mission. Thus, from the irregular ranks of the civic militia to the meticulous formation of the first Republican legions, Rome traced the path that would lead it, centuries later, to dominate an empire stretching from the scorching sands of Egypt to the dark forests of Germania. The Roman legion was not born ready. It was shaped, perfected, and refined through the incessant struggles that marked the early days of Rome, gradually transforming into the most efficient war machine of antiquity. In Rome's relentless march towards supremacy, the structural evolution of the Roman legion emerged as one of the most fascinating and decisive chapters in its military history. The archaic militia system, still bound to the hoplite model, began to show clear signs of obsolescence in the face of the military challenges Rome encountered from the 4th century before Christ onward. It was within this context that one of the most important reforms was consolidated, the replacement of the rigid phalanx with the flexible and ingenious manipular formation, a model that allowed greater adaptability and tactical efficiency across the various battlefields. The traumatic experience of the Battle of the Caudine Forks, fought in the year 321 before Christ against the Samnites, served as a catalyst for this change. The humiliating surrender of the Roman legions, surrounded and forced to pass under the yoke of the victors, exposed the inadequacy of the traditional phalanx against the mountain warriors, whose mobility and knowledge of the terrain overcame the rigidity of the Roman lines. From this episode, Roman generals realized the need to create a more flexible system that favored initiative and autonomy of tactical units on the battlefield. Thus, the manipular system was born, structuring the legion into smaller independent units called maniples. Each legion was composed of about 120 maniples, each consisting of 2 centurions and approximately 120 soldiers. These maniples, organized into 3 staggered lines, hastatito, principes, os, and triarii, represented not only an organizational evolution but also a deeply pragmatic military philosophy. The hastati, young soldiers on the front line, absorbed the initial impact. The principes, experienced veterans, continued the fight, and the triarii, the oldest and most battle-hardened soldiers, formed the final strategic reserve, deployed only in critical moments. This system allowed the legion to operate as a living organism, capable of adapting to terrain conditions and enemy behavior. Unlike the phalanx, which depended on the rigid cohesion of a single line, the manipular formation enabled the opening of gaps, the execution of flanking maneuvers, and the replacement of exhausted troops with fresh units, all while maintaining the discipline and effectiveness that would become trademarks of the Roman legion. However, the structural evolution of the legion was not limited to tactical reorganization. It also paralleled the profound social and political transformations that shook Rome between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ. The territorial expansion and increasingly distant wars imposed upon the city the necessity of maintaining a permanent, more cohesive and professionalized army. Soldiers, who until then had to own property to be conscripted, began to be recruited from among the proletari, the poorest citizens without land, significantly expanding the military contingent and altering the very social composition of the army. The pinnacle of this transformation occurred with the reforms of Gaius Marius, one of the greatest generals in Rome's history, at the end of the 2nd century before Christ. Marius, upon assuming the consulship amidst a severe military crisis caused by the Cimbrian Teutonic invasions, definitively broke with the tradition of an army composed of landowners and instituted the model of the professional legion. His most famous reform, enacted between the years 107 and 104 before Christ, established that any Roman citizen could voluntarily enlist, regardless of land ownership, receiving in return regular pay, state-provided equipment, and the promise of material rewards at the end of service. This professionalization radically altered the nature of the legion. Soldiers, now dependent on the command and generosity of their generals, began to nurture personal loyalty that sometimes surpassed their allegiance to the Senate and the Republic. The Roman army ceased to be a reflection of republican civic virtue and transformed into an autonomous instrument of power, capable of defining political directions and promoting the rise of military strongmen. Furthermore, Marius's reforms introduced significant logistical and organizational innovations. The standardization of equipment, gladius, scutum, pilum, and larica hamata, contributed to the uniformity of the legions and to increased combat efficiency. The Roman soldier, carrying all his equipment during exhausting marches, earned the nickname Marius's Mule, a symbol of the new military conception that prioritized endurance, discipline, and operational autonomy. The introduction of the cohort as an intermediate tactical unit between the maniple and the legion was another milestone in this evolutionary process. Each legion was now composed of 10 cohorts, each with approximately 480 soldiers, which provided greater cohesion and ease of command, especially in the large-scale campaigns that characterized Roman imperial expansion in the following centuries. Therefore, the structural evolution of the legion, from the manipular system to the professional legion, was not merely an adaptation to battlefield demands, but a profound metamorphosis that redefined the very essence of Roman military power. By becoming a permanent, professional, and specialized force, the legion transformed Rome from a republic of citizen soldiers into an empire sustained by a formidable army, whose efficiency and adaptability would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The military reforms led by Gaius Marius at the end of the 2nd century before Christ marked a definitive turning point in the trajectory of the Roman legions, irreversibly altering the relationship between military power, the state, and the Roman citizen. Until then, participation in the army was considered a civic and patriotic duty, limited to landowners who financed their own equipment and regarded military service as an extension of political and social life. However, the transformation proposed by Marius placed the legion at the heart of personal ambitions, both for soldiers and generals, inaugurating a new era in which the army not only defended Rome, but shaped its own destiny and that of the empire. By allowing the proletari, the poorest citizens and previously excluded from formal military life, to enlist and serve as legionaries, Marius opened the door for the army to become a true professional career. The legion, once a temporary and restricted space, was converted into a means of social ascension, offering soldiers tangible benefits, regular pay, state-provided equipment, specialized training, and above all, the promise of rewards after completing their service, such as land in conquered provinces and the status of honored veterans. Thus, thousands of poor and marginalized citizens found in the legions an unprecedented opportunity for dignity, survival, and prosperity. However, this new professional model had political and social consequences of enormous scope. The economic and emotional dependence of soldiers on their commanders created a personal loyalty that often surpassed their bond with the Republic and with Rome's traditional institutions. Victorious generals such as Gaius Marius, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Pompey the Great, and later Julius Caesar, discovered that by guaranteeing military victories and abundant plunder, they could gain not only the absolute devotion of their legions, but also the political power necessary to challenge the Senate and impose their interests through the force of arms. The meteoric rise of Marius illustrates this phenomenon. After his victories in the Numidian Wars and against the Cimbrian Teutons, Marius established himself as the third founder of Rome, boasting such overwhelming military and political prestige that he was elected consul on 7 occasions, an unprecedented and scandalous feat in light of republican traditions. His figure embodied the new paradigm of the general politician, whose authority derived directly from military power and the unconditional support of his legions. The precedent set by Marius triggered a series of internal conflicts that progressively eroded the foundations of the Roman Republic. From the 1st century before Christ onward, the legions became strategic pieces in the internal struggles between political factions and ambitious patricians. The civil wars between Marius and Sulla, later between Caesar and Pompey, and finally between Mark Antony and Octavian, were all fueled by the instrumentalization of the legions as autonomous political forces capable of deciding on the battlefield who would govern Rome and control its vast empire. This irreversible process culminated in the replacement of the republican system by the Principato, established by Octavian, who, under the title of Augustus, became the first Roman emperor in the year 27 before Christ. Paradoxically, the legions that had been born as an expression of republican civism became the military pillar of imperial autocracy. Under the empire, the legion remained a highly prestigious professional career, but now deeply integrated into the state machinery, being carefully managed, rewarded, and controlled by the emperor and his trusted generals. However, the legacy of Marius's reforms transcended the military and political sphere, also influencing Roman culture and mentality. The professional Roman soldier became a symbol of virtues, the excellence, courage, and discipline that characterized the Roman masculine ideal. The cult of victorious generals, triumphal celebrations, and the monumentalization of military conquests, as seen in the Column of Trajan or the Arch of Titus, reinforced the image of the legion as the protagonist of Rome's greatness and destiny. Finally, it is impossible to dissociate Marius's legacy from the complex dialectic between power and loyalty that permeated all of Roman history thereafter. The professionalization of the legion strengthened Rome and secured its territorial conquests, but it also sowed the seeds of political instability and civil wars that would accompany the gradual decline of the Republic. The model of the professional legion, forged under Marius's visionary leadership, thus became both an instrument of glory and a harbinger of the convulsions that would forever transform the face of Rome and the Mediterranean world. The unparalleled strength of the Roman legion resided not only in the individual courage of its soldiers, but primarily in the meticulous organization, rigid hierarchy, and functional specialization that transformed it into the most formidable military machine of antiquity. Structured with almost mathematical precision, the legion embodied the principles of discipline, order, and efficiency, which allowed it to adapt to multiple combat scenarios, endure prolonged campaigns, and effectively conquer and maintain the vast Roman Empire. At the height of its classical configuration, between the 1st century before Christ and the 2nd century after Christ, the legion consisted, on average, of about 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, divided into smaller, highly coordinated units. The core of the legion was formed by the Count's legionaries, Roman citizens who were trained, equipped, and subordinated to an inflexible chain of command, in which each role was clearly defined and essential to the functioning of the whole. At the top of this hierarchy was the Bicus Legatus Legionis, the legate, usually a high-ranking senator, appointed by the emperor to command the entire legion. His authority extended from conducting military operations to administering the camp and enforcing troop discipline. Subordinate to him was the Tribunus Laticlavius, a young aristocrat at the beginning of his political and military career, responsible for administrative tasks, assisting the legate, and leading the legion in his absence. Below them were the 5 Tribuni Angusticlavi, officers of equestrian origin who assisted in supervising the cohorts and commanding specific detachments. However, the operational heart of the legion beat under the command of the Centurions, veterans hardened by experience, responsible for directly leading the troops on the battlefield. Each centurion led a century legion, a unit composed of approximately 80 legionaries, and was assisted by an optio, who acted as his second in command and replaced him in case of absence or death. Within the century was the signifer, the standard bearer responsible for carrying the vexillum, a fundamental visual symbol for the cohesion and orientation of the troops during combat. The standard was not only a positioning marker, it embodied the spirit and honor of the unit, defended with life if necessary. Complementing this corps was the cornicen, responsible for the sound signals transmitted through the horn, ensuring efficient communication amidst the chaos of battle. However, the ultimate symbol of the legion was the aquila, the legionary eagle, carried by the aquilifer, an elite soldier whose mission transcended the tactical plane and assumed an almost sacred dimension. Losing the eagle in combat was considered the greatest dishonor a legion could suffer, while its protection was a source of supreme pride. The eagle represented not only the spirit of the legion, but the very soul of Rome. The legion also relied on a diverse range of specialists and auxiliaries, whose importance was vital to the army's operation in the field. Notable among these were the fabri, engineers responsible for constructing fortifications, bridges, and siege machines, the medici, military doctors, who ensured the treatment of the wounded, and the lixi, responsible for logistics and supply, ensuring that the legion remained well provisioned even in inhospitable and remote territories. In addition to the corps formed by the legionaries, the legion included the auxiliary troops, or auxilia, composed of non-citizen soldiers recruited from the provinces of the empire. These men played crucial complementary roles, providing light and heavy cavalry, archers, slingers, and infantry units specialized in tactics adapted to the various terrains where Rome waged war. Although initially considered inferior to legionaries, over time, service in the auxiliary troops came to be rewarded with the granting of Roman citizenship, which encouraged enlistment and strengthened loyalty to the empire. The structure of the legion was further complemented by the cohortscurii, tactical units intermediate between the legion and the century. Each legion was composed of 10 cohorts, of which the first cohort hall was the most prestigious and numerous, consisting of veteran soldiers often entrusted with the most critical missions. This segmentation granted the legion extraordinary flexibility, allowing it to deploy in various formations according to strategic needs, from long marching columns to compact lines for direct confrontation. The hierarchical and functional organization of the Roman legion was not only a reflection of its military efficiency, but also of a worldview deeply marked by discipline, order, and belief in civic duty. Every soldier, from the humblest legionary to the most illustrious legate, occupied a determined place in this system, whose well-adjusted mechanism made the legion not a mere gathering of warriors, but a cohesive, disciplined, and practically invincible entity. This structure, forged and perfected over centuries, not only ensured the conquest of an empire that stretched from the sands of Syria to the mists of Britannia, but also bequeathed to posterity an organizational model that would inspire armed forces for millennia. The Roman legion, with its relentless hierarchy and functional specialization, remains the ultimate archetype of a military institution capable of transforming history through the strength of its discipline and the ingenuity of its organization. At the core of the Roman legion's invincibility lay an indispensable factor: the rigorous and systematic training, designed to mold ordinary men into exceptional soldiers, capable of enduring the harshest adversities and obeying their commander's orders without hesitation. Military discipline, elevated to the status of supreme civic virtue, was not merely an ideal but a daily practice, cultivated with unwavering zeal from the moment a recruit joined the legion's ranks. The formation process of a legionary began with a rigorous selection, supervised by the centurions, who evaluated not only the candidate's physical health and robustness, but also his mental readiness to withstand the rigors of training and life on campaign. The ability to march long distances carrying heavy loads, proficiency in weapon handling, and resistance to fatigue were essential requirements. Those who did not demonstrate the necessary fortitude were summarily rejected, as the legion could not afford weaknesses within its ranks. Once accepted, the recruit underwent intensive and continuous training, with methods developed over centuries aimed not only at technical improvement, but above all at internalizing discipline as an automatic and unquestionable reflex. Forced marches, often up to 30 kilometers per day, were carried out in full gear: gladius, pilum, scutum, and personal backpack, weighing about 30 kilograms, an exercise designed to prepare the soldier for the rapid and exhausting movements frequently demanded by military campaigns. Weapons training was equally meticulous. Legionaries practiced individual and formation combat, using wooden weapons, heavier than the real ones, to strengthen their muscles and refine technique. This gladius was wielded with precise thrusts, prioritizing lethal efficiency over flashy strikes. Mastering the pilum required coordination and strength, aiming to incapacitate the enemy and neutralize their defensive capabilities. Proficiency with the scutum was fundamental for forming the renowned testudo, the tortoise formation that shielded the legion under an impenetrable canopy of shields. Collective training reinforced cohesion and trust among the soldiers, indispensable pillars for the legion's effectiveness. Tactical maneuvers were incessantly repeated until each legionary instinctively knew his position and role in every combat situation. Line formation, cohort advancement, unit rotation, and the orderly replacement of the wounded were practiced to exhaustion, creating a military force that operated as a unified, disciplined, and lethal organism. Discipline was maintained not only through training, but also through a strict system of rewards and punishments. Promotion within the legionary hierarchy, such as advancement to optio or on centurion, was reserved for those who demonstrated courage, exemplary discipline, and competence. On the other hand, indiscipline, cowardice, or desertion were severely punished. Among the most feared penalties was the decimation, a collective punishment applied to units that failed in combat or mutinied. 1 in every 10 soldiers was executed by their own comrades, an extreme measure aimed at reinforcing cohesion and disciplinary terror. The rigor of training was not limited to preparation for battle. Logistical and engineering skills were equally cultivated, as the Roman legionary was simultaneously a soldier and a builder. Each legion was responsible for how constructing fortified camps. At the end of each day's march, a practice that required precision, physical strength, and technical knowledge. Digging trenches, erecting palisades, setting up tents, and efficiently organizing the castrum were part of every soldier's mandatory repertoire. The psychological dimension of training was as relevant as the physical. The Roman legionary was educated to understand that discipline and absolute obedience were indispensable not only for victory, but for survival itself. Blind trust in the centurion's orders, solidarity with unit comrades, and readiness to sacrifice oneself for the legion and for Rome were instilled daily, shaping a martial ethos that transcended generations and became one of Rome's most powerful cultural legacies. This relentless and severe training made the Roman legion not only an efficient military force, but a true instrument of cultural and political domination. The legionaries' ability to endure long campaigns in inhospitable territories, to build fortifications and roads, and to maintain order in distant provinces consolidated Roman power wherever their sandals tread. Thus, through rigorous training, Rome not only forged soldiers but shaped conquerors and colonizers whose impact would endure far beyond the fleeting glories of the battlefield. The power of the Roman legion resided not only in its unmatched organization and discipline, but also in its carefully designed arsenal, which combined lethal efficiency, practicality, and extraordinary adaptive ingenuity. The legionaries' weapons were not merely tools of combat. They were extensions of the very body and symbols of Roman military supremacy, the result of centuries of technological evolution and the assimilation of the best warfare practices from conquered peoples. The legionaries' primary and most emblematic weapon was the gladius, a short, straight, and sharp sword, generally about 50 to 60 centimeters in length. Derived from Celtic and Iberian models assimilated during Rome's campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula, the gladius was perfected to maximize efficiency in close combat. Unlike the long, heavy swords of other armies, the gladius was designed for quick, precise thrusts, aiming to strike vital organs with short movements that could be executed even in the dense formations typical of the legion. The legionary's obsessive training with the gladius ensured that he could neutralize his opponent with minimal movement, reducing risk while increasing lethality. Complementing the gladius, the legion employed one of the most ingenious weapons of antiquity, the pilum divius, a throwing spear designed not only to wound, but also to disorganize and neutralize the enemy even before close contact. Measuring approximately 2 meters in length, the pilum had a sturdy wooden shaft and a long, thin iron tip designed to penetrate shields and armor. The pilum's great innovation lay in the fact that its tip would bend or break upon impact, rendering the enemy's shield unusable and preventing the spear from being hurled back at the Romans. This weapon exemplifies the pragmatic genius of Roman military engineering, always guided by the pursuit of maximum efficiency and tactical superiority. The scutum, the Roman shield, completed the legionaries' essential triad. With its rectangular and curved in shape, the scutum measured approximately 1.20 meters in height by 75 centimeters in width, offering ample protection to the soldier and fitting perfectly into the attestudo formation, the famous tortoise that shielded the legion from enemy projectiles during sieges and assaults. Covered with leather and reinforced by a metal edge, the scutum was not only a passive defense, but also an offensive weapon, used to push, destabilize, and knock down the opponent during the advance. The legionaries' personal protection was ensured by the lorica segmentata, a type of armor made up of articulated metal plates fastened by leather straps. Although not all legions had uniform access to this model, many soldiers continued to use the traditional lorica hamata, made of iron mail. The segmentata became one of the visual icons of the Roman soldier, symbolizing the balance between protection, mobility, and durability. Roman armor was designed to withstand the most common battlefield impacts, while allowing the soldier to maintain the agility necessary for the rapid, coordinated maneuvers characteristic of the legion. In addition to these primary weapons and protections, the legionary had a range of auxiliary equipment that ensured his survival and effectiveness in the field. Among these were the ipugio, a short dagger used as a last line of defense or in emergencies, the caligae, sandals reinforced with metal studs that provided traction and endurance during long marches, and the gallia, the bronze or iron helmet designed with cheek and neck guards, offering protection against direct blows without compromising vision or hearing. No less important was the akan military belt, or cingulum, adorned with metal strips that not only protected the lower abdomen, but also expressed the legionary's status and pride. This belt was a distinctive mark of military identity, worn both in combat and daily life in camp, representing belonging to the legionary order and submission to its relentless discipline. Beyond individual armament, The Roman legion stood out for its strategic use of collective equipment and military engines that enhanced its offensive and defensive power. Catapulte and ballistae, large-scale projectile machines, were employed both in open battles and sieges, launching projectiles capable of destroying walls or decimating enemy formations. Assault towers, ramps, and battering rams completed the Roman siege arsenal, demonstrating the legion's capacity to transcend direct combat and dominate through engineering warfare as well. The success of Roman weaponry did not reside solely in the quality of individual arms, but in how they were integrated into collective tactics and formations, maximizing their effectiveness and compensating for potential weaknesses. The legionary did not fight alone, but as part of a military machine that, synchronized and disciplined, transformed the lethal potential of each weapon into an irresistible force. Thus, the technology and innovation reflected in the armament of the Roman legion were essential pillars of imperial expansion, ensuring that from Hispania to the Middle East, from the Germanic forests to the African sands, the name of Rome was synonymous with military might and invincibility. Roman military engineering, by combining functional simplicity with strategic sophistication, bequeathed to the world not only a technical model, but also an eternal lesson on how material and organizational superiority can transform history. The supremacy of the Roman legion on the battlefield was not solely the result of the individual courage of its soldiers or the superior quality of its weaponry, but above all, the mastery with which its tactics and military formations were conceived, taught, and executed. The art of war in Rome was built upon the foundations of collective discipline, strategic innovation, and a remarkable ability to adapt to the most diverse circumstances and enemies, transforming the legion into a uniquely versatile and invincible military force for centuries. At the heart of legionary tactics was the tripartite organization inherited from the manipular system, hastati, principes, and motriarii, arranged in staggered lines that allowed alternation and flexibility during combat. The hastati, young and vigorous, composed the front line, absorbing the initial impact and testing enemy strength. If repelled, they would retreat to the rear, replaced by the principes, more experienced soldiers who continued the fight. As a last resort, the triarii intervened, hardened veterans whose entry into combat signaled the extreme gravity of the situation. Hence the Roman adage, ad triarios redice. It was necessary to resort to the triarii, an expression evoking the notion of an impending crisis. This system endowed the legion with a resilience and tactical depth that few armies of antiquity could match. But Roman innovation did not stop with this classical structure. With the advent of Gaius Marius's reforms and the adoption of Hunker cohorts as the principal units, the legion gained even greater cohesion and maneuverability. Each cohort, composed of approximately 480 legionaries, could operate semi-independently, allowing the legion to divide, encircle, or envelop the enemy with devastating effectiveness. Among the legion's most celebrated formations was the testudo rimes, or tortoise, a defensive arrangement in which soldiers in the front and side ranks raised their shields forward, while those in the center held them overhead, creating a true collective shell that protected the unit from projectiles launched from walls or hills. This formation was particularly effective during fortification assaults or prolonged sieges, allowing steady and safe advancement even under intense barrages of arrows, stones, or spears. For open-field combat, line formations and the triple battle order were preferred. The legion positioned itself in a rectangular formation with cohorts arranged side by side and in depth. This configuration allowed both the absorption of the initial shock and the execution of enveloping maneuvers, such as the acuneoses, or wedge formation, used to penetrate enemy lines, or the orbis as, a circular defensive formation adopted in desperate siege situations where the legion needed to withstand encirclement. Coordinating these formations required precise communication, carried out through visual signals, standards and banners carried by the B, signifer E, and aquilifer, and auditory signals, trumpets, horns, and buccinae, that transmitted orders to advance, retreat, or alter formation amid the din of battle. The legionary was trained to respond to these signals with automatic reflexes, ensuring the synchronized execution of collective movements that surprised and crushed the enemy. Beyond excellence in shock tactics, the Roman legion excelled in siege warfare, a field in which its technical and organizational superiority was unmatched. Roman military engineers, or fabri, built with extraordinary speed, assault towers, battering rams, and siege engines, enabling legions to besiege fortified cities efficiently and precisely. Julius Caesar's works during the siege of Alesia, in the year 52 before Christ, are a classic example of this capability. By simultaneously constructing a line of fortifications to contain the besieged city and another to protect the legion from an external relief army, Caesar demonstrated the strategic genius and technical competence that characterized the Roman army. Another crucial aspect of Roman military art was its capacity to adapt to the combat styles of various enemies faced along the vast imperial frontiers. Against the Gauls and Germans, whose strength lay in the impetuosity and ferocity of their charges, the legion responded with cohesive formations, raised shields and short, precise thrusts, thwarting the adversary's numerical superiority. In facing the Parthians and their long-range cavalry tactics, Rome developed auxiliary units of archers and heavy cavalry, incorporating Eastern practices into its tactical repertoire. The legion also mastered maneuver warfare, capable of conducting rapid marches, flanking the enemy, and establishing fortified defensive positions in record time. Continuous training in engineering and construction enabled every legionary to participate in building castra, fortified camps, at the end of each day's march, ensuring protection and supplies in any territory. Finally, the psychological element of Roman warfare must be emphasized, the deliberate demonstration of discipline, order, and power. Before battle, legions commonly performed as tactical displays, marching in perfect formations, with legionary eagles held aloft, chanting and displaying an impressive array of weaponry, with the aim of intimidating the enemy and bolstering their own morale. The legionaries' almost unshakable confidence in their tactical superiority made the legion not only a physical force, but a psychological phenomenon that paralyzed many opponents even before the first clash. Thus, the art of war practiced by the Roman legion was not a static set of techniques, but a dynamic, adaptable, and continuously perfected system that combined organizational ingenuity, relentless discipline, and strategic intelligence. It was this synthesis that enabled Rome not only to conquer, but also to maintain and integrate an empire that, at its maximum extent, spanned 3 continents and forever shaped the course of human history. Few aspects symbolize so well the discipline, ingenuity, and organization of the Roman legion as its campa or castrum, a structure that transcended the function of simple shelter to become a true manifestation of Roman order and power over conquered territories. With each day's march, the legion, as a cohesive and disciplined body, erected a carefully planned castrum that reflected not only military necessity, but also the Roman mentality of imposing, wherever they were, a model of civilization based on rationality, efficiency, and security. The construction of the legionary camp was not an occasional task, but a daily ritual, repeated with relentless precision at the end of each day's march. Every legionary was responsible for transporting the necessary tools, shovels, hoes, stakes, and pickaxes, as the building of the castrum was considered as essential a skill as handling the gladius or the pilum. Thus, the Roman soldier was not only a warrior, but also an engineer and builder, capable of transforming the natural environment into a fortress within a few hours. The architectural design of the castrum followed a standardized model that allowed for rapid deployment on any type of terrain, from the fertile valleys of Gaul to the scorching deserts of Syria. The basic layout was rectangular, surrounded by a deep ditch-cow fossa and an earth and wood rampart, agger, atop which a defensive palisade was erected. Entry into the interior was through 4 main gates, placed on each side and protected by towers and guards, the most important of which was the Porta Praetoria, oriented towards the enemy. The internal space of the castrum was meticulously organized into sectors and streets, forming an orthogonal grid that facilitated circulation, defense, and administration. At the center stood the Praetorium, the tent or headquarters of the legion's commander, symbolizing the core of military authority. Around the praetorium were arranged the barracks of the cohorts, or a contubernia, small tents housing groups of 8 soldiers each. This division fostered a spirit of camaraderie and facilitated logistical management, as each contubernium was responsible for preparing its own food and maintaining its equipment. In addition to accommodations, the castrum included indispensable facilities for the legion's operation on campaign, such as supply warehouses, horia, stables for horses, stabula, repair workshops, fabricae, and even communal latrines, whose presence illustrates the level of sophistication and concern for hygiene that characterized the Roman army. The existence of areas designated for training, such as exercise fields and spaces for religious rituals, with altars dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, or Mithras, reveals that the castrum was not just a military stronghold, but also a microcosm of Roman life. Daily life in the legionary camp was governed by an inflexible routine. At dawn, the legionaries conducted weapons and equipment inspections, followed by physical and combat exercises. Maintenance of the fortifications was a constant priority, as was vigilance on the walls and patrolling. Meal preparation, typically consisting of bread, legumes, salted meat, and diluted wine, was carried out in groups, reinforcing bonds of solidarity among the soldiers. Although the castrum was conceived as a temporary structure, its quality of construction was such that it often evolved into permanent fortifications, later becoming military colonies, and eventually Roman cities. Thus, along the empire's frontiers, cities such as Vindobona, modern Vienna, and Eboracum, modern York, emerged as lasting testimonies of Roman presence and influence. The castrum also exercised an enormously significant symbolic function. Wherever the legion camped, Roman order was imposed, represented by the precise geometry of the streets, the solidity of the walls, and the unquestionable authority of the commander. This ability to quickly transform any location into a bastion of power and security gave the legion an unparalleled strategic advantage, allowing it to establish defensive and logistical positions that ensured control over vast territories. Moreover, the camp was a place where the Roman soldier could recover from the fatigue of marching and combat, reinforcing the importance of the human element within the Roman military machine. Daily life in the castrum forged bonds of camaraderie and mutual trust, fundamental to the cohesion and effectiveness of the legion in battle. The sharing of tasks, meals, and dangers created a sense of belonging and pride that transcended regional and social differences among legionaries. Thus, the legionary camp was not merely a practical necessity, but a concrete expression of Roman military mentality and culture. The belief in order, discipline, and the ability to shape the world according to the principles and interests of Rome. Each castrum erected by the legions was, therefore, an ephemeral but deeply significant monument of Roman expansion, an indelible mark of Rome's presence at the fringes of the known world. The Roman legion, more than just a military body, was the fundamental instrument through which Rome expanded its borders, consolidated its hegemony, and transformed a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber into the greatest empire of antiquity. Roman military campaigns, carried out by disciplined and strategically superior legions, were true expeditions of conquest and colonization that demanded from the troops superhuman physical endurance, unbreakable discipline, and a tactical versatility that few enemies could match across centuries of history. The start of any Roman military campaign began with a meticulously planned march, which could extend over thousands of kilometers through adverse geographies, mountains, deserts, forests, and rivers. Each legionary carried with him heavy personal equipment, including weapons, armor, engineering tools, provisions, and camp utensils, totaling about 30 kilograms. This load transformed each soldier into a poor Marius's mule, an expression that symbolized the resilience and self-sufficiency acquired after the military reforms of the 2nd century before Christ. The marches were organized into strictly ordered columns, preceded by scouts and engineers who assessed the terrain, traced routes, and built passages, bridges, or roads as necessary. The legion did not depend on cities or villages for its supplies. It carried everything it needed, thanks to a sophisticated logistical system that included wagon convoys, pack animals, and detachments specialized in foraging. This capability allowed the legion to penetrate deeply into hostile territories and remain operational for long periods without relying on fragile supply lines. Upon reaching enemy territory, the legion established a castrum, a fortified camp that functioned as an operations base, defensive stronghold, and logistical center. From there, Roman generals devised strategies that combined brute force with diplomatic and psychological tactics. The enemy was confronted not only by the physical presence of an imposing military force, but also by deliberate demonstrations of discipline and power, impeccable formations, tactical displays, and at times negotiations offering favorable terms for peaceful surrender. When combat was inevitable, the legion demonstrated its supremacy through a lethal combination of tactical versatility and physical endurance. Battles often began with the synchronized launch of the immersive, aimed at disrupting the enemy line, followed by a coordinated advance in compact formation with the gladius man at the ready for short and deadly thrusts. The superiority of Roman tactics lay in the ability to maintain cohesion under pressure, rotating the ranks as needed, while officers, centurions, tribunes, and the legate commanded the operation from strategically established positions, ensuring the precise execution of maneuvers. Historical examples abound and demonstrate the effectiveness of Roman military campaigns. The Conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar, between the years 58 and 50 before Christ, is one of the most impressive. Caesar led his legions through vast and unknown territories, facing warlike tribes, overcoming formidable natural obstacles, and winning emblematic battles such as Alesia, where he masterfully employed military engineering by surrounding and isolating the Gallic army of Vercingetorix. At the end of the campaign, Gaul was integrated into the empire, and Rome consolidated its presence in Western Europe, extending its culture, language, and laws for centuries. Another notable example is the campaigns in Britain, initiated by Claudius court in the year 43 after Christ. The Roman legions landed in hostile territory, confronting local tribes such as the Catuvellani, and later the rebels led by Queen Fool Boudica. Despite logistical difficulties and constant ambushes, the legions demonstrated resilience and effectiveness, building roads, establishing permanent castra, and founding cities that became the seeds of important urban centers, such as Londinium, London. Military campaigns were not limited to territorial conquests. They were also fundamental for the maintenance and defense of the empire's frontiers, the limes. In border regions such as Germania, Syria, or North Africa, the continuous presence of legions ensured stability, suppressed revolts, and commanded respect from neighboring peoples. The construction of permanent fortifications, such as Hadrian's walls in Britain or the Limesgore in Germania, attests to the legion's capacity not only to conquer, but also to consolidate and protect Rome's domains. Military campaigns also functioned as instruments of Romanization, promoting the dissemination of Roman culture, language, and institutions. Wherever they passed, the legions left indelible marks: roads, aqueducts, cities, and even communities formed by veterans who, upon receiving land as a reward, settled in the provinces and perpetuated Roman values and way of life. On an individual level, military campaigns represented for the legionary an opportunity for glory, wealth, and social ascent. The sacrificial spoils of war, or the rewards and the land grants offered at the end of service, encouraged participation in the most risky and distant campaigns, fueling Rome's expansionist spirit and ensuring the constant renewal of military ranks. Thus, Roman military campaigns were not mere military operations, but complex enterprises that integrated military, political, economic, and cultural strategies. It was these campaigns, carried out with the precision and discipline that characterized the legion, that enabled the creation and maintenance of an unprecedented empire in history, whose legacy still resonates in the traces of its roads, the ruins of its cities, and the collective memory of Western civilization. The Roman legion was not merely the military instrument of Rome's territorial expansion, but also the most effective agent in the complex and enduring process of Romanization of the provinces, a phenomenon that transformed local cultures, reshaped urban landscapes, and forged a new political and social identity that would endure for centuries beyond the fall of the empire. Wherever they marched, fought, and settled, The legions brought not only the iron and fire of conquest, but also the institutions, language, customs, and material structures of Rome, acting as a civilizing vanguard and consolidating imperial dominion over vast and diverse territories. The process of Romanization began with the very physical presence of the legion, which required the construction of permanent military infrastructures, such as castra, roads, bridges, and fortifications, quickly integrating into the local social and economic fabric. The Samcastrium frequently evolved into military colonies and later into Roman cities, characterized by typical urban organization, the Ticado and Decumanus, main streets crossing at right angles, the E Forum, center of political and economic life, and public buildings, such as baths, theaters, temples, and markets, all inspired by the architectural models of the urbs. Military roads, initially conceived to facilitate the rapid movement of legions and supplies, ended up integrating entire regions into the empire's administrative network, promoting the circulation of people, goods, and ideas. The famous expression, "all roads lead to Rome," precisely reflects this impact. A road system that connected the most distant provinces to the heart of the empire, accelerating cultural assimilation and the spread of Latin, Roman law, and religious and administrative practices. The legionaries themselves, during their long years of service, often 20 or more, formed deep ties with local populations. Although the law formally prohibited legionaries from marrying while on active duty, in practice, many formed informal families with local women, giving rise to a vast mixed population that facilitated cultural integration. Upon receiving land, as a reward at the end of their careers, veterans settled in the provinces, acting as agents of Romanization, disseminating values, agricultural practices, and Roman institutions, and ensuring the loyalty of local populations to imperial power. The legions also played a decisive role in the implementation of Roman legal and administrative institutions in the provinces. Military presence guaranteed the application of Roman law, ensured tax collection, and suppressed revolts, creating a political stability that favored the adoption of Roman customs by local elites. Many of these elites, eager to participate in the imperial system, began sending their sons to be educated according to Roman standards, adopting the Latin language and entering administrative or military careers, reinforcing the acculturation process. In the religious sphere, the legions acted as vectors for the spread of traditional Roman cults, such as those of Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva, but also facilitated religious syncretism by absorbing and adapting local deities. A notable example is the expansion of Mithraism, an Eastern cult that quickly spread among Roman soldiers and was integrated into the Roman pantheon, especially in frontier regions. This symbiotic interaction between religion, culture, and power contributed to the formation of an imperial identity that, although heterogeneous, shared fundamental common elements. Moreover, the legions, as a highly skilled labor force, participated in the construction of monumental public works, leaving indelible marks on the provinces. Aqueducts, bridges, walls, and public buildings that still testify to the Roman presence in regions as distant as Britain, Germania, Syria, and North Africa. These works not only served military and administrative interests, but also improved the quality of life for local populations, reinforcing the attractiveness of the Roman model. However, the Romanization promoted by the legions was not a uniform or peaceful process. In many regions, cultural and political resistance persisted for generations, as demonstrated by the revolts in Judea, the rebellions of the Britons under Boudica, or the stubborn resistance of the Germans, led by Arminius. In such situations, the legion responded with relentless military campaigns, but also intensified cultural assimilation processes, employing not only force, but also the allure of the Roman way of life, the Pax Romana, citizenship, commercial opportunities, and the material benefits associated with integration into the empire. Over time, this process resulted in the formation of a vast imperial community, unified not only by military subjugation, but also by a shared cultural identity that, although diverse in its regional expressions, recognized the Roman model as the benchmark of civilization, power, and order. The legacy of this process is still visible today, not only in the archaeological ruins scattered across 3 continents, but also in the languages, legal systems, and cultural traditions that directly descend from this unique synthesis forged under the legion's banner. Thus, the Roman legions were more than conquering soldiers. They were city founders, agents of cultural transformation, and architects of a world that, despite the vicissitudes of history, continues to decisively influence the present. The Romanization of the provinces, conducted and consolidated by the legion's steady march, represents one of the most complex and enduring phenomena in history, an eloquent testimony to the transformative power that a disciplined and organized military institution can exert over the destinies of entire peoples. In the vast panorama of wars that shaped the history of antiquity, few compare in scale and impact to the Punic Wars, a series of 3 titanic conflicts fought between Rome and Carthage between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ. These wars not only determined which of the 2 Mediterranean superpowers would prevail, but also consolidated the supremacy of the Roman legion as the most formidable military force of its time. Rome's victory over Carthage was, in large measure, a victory of the legion's flexibility, discipline, and ingenuity over Carthage's commercial wealth, powerful navy, and mercenary army. The First Punic War, which began in the year 264 before Christ, marked the first major confrontation between Rome and Carthage, disputing supremacy over the island of Sicily. Although traditionally a land power, the war forced Rome to develop for the first time a naval fleet capable of confronting Carthage's powerful navy. Yet even at sea, the Romans applied the principles that made their legion invincible on land: discipline and adaptation. The invention of the Corvus, a mobile boarding bridge that allowed legionaries to board enemy ships and transform naval combat into a land battle, was a masterful example of this capacity. After more than 2 decades of war, Rome's victory resulted in the annexation of Sicily as its first overseas province, inaugurating a new era of imperial expansion. But it was in the Second Punic War, fought between 218 and 201 before Christ, that the legion faced its greatest challenge, and by overcoming it definitively affirmed its superiority. The Carthaginian military genius Hannibal Barca, leading a mixed army of Iberian, Numidian troops and war elephants, executed the spectacular crossing of the Alps and inflicted successive and humiliating defeats on the Roman legions at the battles of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and, above all, at Cannae in 216 before Christ, considered one of the greatest military catastrophes in Roman history. At Cannae, Hannibal employed a double envelopment maneuver that annihilated about 50,000 Roman soldiers within hours, demonstrating the vulnerability of the legion when poorly commanded or used rigidly. However, this defeat, far from sealing Rome's fate, triggered a reaction based precisely on the qualities that defined the legion: resilience, adaptability, and discipline. Under generals such as Fabius Maximus, who applied the tactic of avoiding direct confrontation and wearing down the enemy, the famous Fabian strategy, and later Publius Cornelius Scipio, who took the war to the heart of Africa, the legion recovered, reinvented itself, and ultimately triumphed. The definitive victory occurred at the Battle of Zama in 202 before Christ, where Scipio, later known as Africanus, defeated Hannibal on African soil, ending the Second Punic War and imposing humiliating conditions on Carthage: the loss of its overseas possessions, a drastic limitation of its military force, and the imposition of heavy indemnities. This victory was not only military, but also symbolic. The legion had proven its ability to learn from mistakes, overcome extreme adversities, and prevail against one of history's greatest strategists. The Third Punic War, fought between 149 and 146 before Christ, was more an extermination campaign than a traditional military conflict. Fearing Carthage's economic and military recovery, Rome decided to eliminate its ancient rival definitively. Under the command of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, the legions besieged Carthage for 3 years until they finally invaded and destroyed the city, killing or enslaving its inhabitants and razing its structures. The complete destruction of Carthage marked the apex of Roman power and symbolized the uncontested supremacy of the legion as an instrument of conquest and domination. The Punic Wars were a proving ground for the Roman legion, which demonstrated in each of these campaigns its capacity for adaptation, endurance, and supremacy over seemingly superior military forces. While the Carthaginian army relied largely on mercenaries and fragile alliances, the legion was based on cohesion, discipline, and the commitment of its soldiers, elements that proved decisive in the long and bloody struggle for control of the Mediterranean. Moreover, victory over Carthage granted Rome dominion over vast territories and resources, accelerating its transformation from a peninsular power into a transcontinental empire. The legions began operating frequently in newly conquered provinces, establishing permanent garrisons, founding colonies, and expanding the Romanization process that would consolidate the political and cultural unity of the Mediterranean world under Rome's rule. Thus, the Punic Wars were not only a central episode in Rome's military history, but the event that consecrated the legion as the supreme instrument of power, capable of shaping the destinies of nations and definitively altering the geography and history of the ancient world. The Mediterranean, which was once a mare nostrum shared by multiple powers, became, after Rome's victory, effectively Unar Sea, the exclusive domain of Roman might and a testament to the legion's triumph over the most formidable challenges it had ever faced. With the consolidation of the Roman Empire and the expansion of its borders to the most remote limits of Europe, Asia, and Africa, the legions came to play a fundamental role not only as instruments of conquest, but above all as guardians of the limes. The vast and complex system of frontiers that demarcated and protected the Roman world from external barbarism. Along these frontiers, which stretched for thousands of kilometers, from the walls of Britain to the deserts of Syria, the permanent presence of the legions ensured the empire's internal stability and guaranteed security against incursions from hostile and rebellious peoples. The concept of civic was much more than a physical line. It represented a militarized zone composed of human fortifications, watchtowers, ditches, defensive ramparts, and above all, strategically positioned legionary garrisons. The role of these troops was not only to repel invasions, but also to monitor the movements of frontier peoples, deter rebellions, and keep adjacent territories under surveillance, ensuring the balance between Rome and the barbarians who inhabited lands beyond its dominion. One of the most emblematic examples of this defensive system was Hadrian's Wall, erected in northern Britain during the reign of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century after Christ. Stretching about 120 kilometers, this imposing stone and earth wall, dotted with forts, observation towers, and fortified gates, aimed to contain incursions by the Pictish and Caledonian tribes who lived beyond the frontier. The legions stationed along the wall not only defended the territory, but also regulated trade and transit, acting as a police and administrative force in a permanently unstable region. Another notable example was the defense of the Limes Germanicus, a line of fortifications extending along the Rhine and Danube, marking the border between the empire and the Germanic tribes. This region was particularly volatile, marked by constant conflicts, as tragically demonstrated in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 after Christ, when 3 legions commanded by Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated by a Germanic coalition led by Arminius I. This disaster revealed the challenges faced by the legions in defending the limes and led Rome to adopt a more defensive posture in the region, consolidating fortifications and avoiding further expansionist adventures beyond the Rhine. On the eastern frontier, the limes Orientalisti faced different challenges, stemming from rivalries with organized powers such as the Parthians and later the Sassanid Persians. The legions stationed in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Armenia not only defended the empire's borders, but often engaged in large-scale wars, such as the campaigns of Trajan, which brought the legions as far as the Persian Gulf at the beginning of the 2nd century after Christ. The constant tension on this frontier required a permanent and highly professionalized military presence, as well as complex diplomatic and logistical strategies. The role of the legions on the frontiers was not limited to combat. They were responsible for the construction and maintenance of fortifications, the conduct of regular patrols, the recruitment of auxiliary troops from local populations, and the economic and cultural integrations of frontier regions into the empire. The daily life of the legions on the frontiers, far from the splendor of conquest campaigns, was marked by arduous and meticulous routines, guarding, building, training, and occasionally repelling sudden and violent attacks. Beyond physical defense, the legions played a vital role in the symbolic assertion of Roman power. The fortifications erected along the frontiers, often monumental, not only provided protection, but also proclaimed the presence and authority of Rome. The pre-inscription of legions and emperors on stones, arches, and boundary markers served as a testament to imperial greatness and as a warning to the peoples who lived beyond the limes of Rome's strength and permanence. However, the stability of Rome's frontiers was always fragile, subject to demographic pressures, mass migrations, and internal conflicts. Throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, the legions had to contend with large-scale barbarian invasions, such as those of the Goths, Vandals, and Huns, who, driven by complex dynamics in their own lands, crossed the limes and penetrated ever more deeply into imperial territory. These incursions tested the resilience and effectiveness of Rome's defensive system, revealing its limitations in the face of new forms of warfare and the mobility of barbarian peoples. Despite these growing difficulties, the legion's presence along the frontiers allowed Rome to maintain, for centuries, an extraordinary level of stability and security for an empire of such vastness. Border control not only ensured military defense, but also facilitated the circulation of goods, people, and cultures, promoting the Romanization of peripheral regions and consolidating the unity of the empire. Thus, the legions on the frontiers were not merely silent sentinels at the edge of the known world, but active protagonists in the maintenance of Roman order, security, and identity. Their tireless vigilance, built upon walls of stone and fields of battle, upheld for centuries the very idea of Rome as an empire without limits, capable of resisting, adapting, and enduring against the relentless challenges posed by the peoples who lived beyond the limes. As Rome consolidated itself as an empire, the Roman legions, which had initially served as instruments of conquest and defense, began to play an increasingly decisive role in the political arena, becoming the fundamental factor in legitimating and ascending to the imperial throne. The power of the legions evolved far beyond the battlefield. They became the arbiters of imperial destiny, capable of crowning or overthrowing emperors, consolidating a singular phenomenon in Roman history, the militarization of political power. This process began during the transition from republic to empire, when generals such as Gaius Julius Caesar realized that the unconditional support of the legions could overcome the Senate's resistance and alter the very constitutional order of Rome. The Tatar crossing of the Rubicon. In 49 before Christ, when Caesar marched with his legion on Rome, was not just a military act, but a definitive political statement. The Roman army, loyal to its commander, could decide the republic's future. During the imperial period, this dynamic not only persisted but intensified, with the consolidation of the Principate under Octavian Augustus. Efforts were made to limit the political power of the legions by centralizing military command in the hands of the emperor, who formerly held supreme authority, the Imperium, over all armed forces. However, in practice, the legions maintained personal loyalty to their immediate commanders, who in times of crisis or ambition could rival the emperor himself. One of the most iconic examples of this reality was the role of the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit stationed in Rome, initially created to protect the emperor and his family. Over the centuries, however, the Praetorian Guard frequently acted as an autonomous political instrument, deposing emperors, assassinating those who became unpopular or undesirable, and crowning new rulers according to their own interests. The most notorious case was the sale of the imperial throne to Didius Julianus in 193 after Christ, following the assassination of Pertinax, an episode that marked the height of the corruption and political degradation promoted by the Praetorians. Outside Rome, the legions stationed in the provinces played an equally decisive role in the political game. Frontier generals, often commanding several legions, accumulated military power that could be quickly converted into political capital. Imperial succession thus often came to be decided not in Rome but in the camps and barracks of the legions. Military support became the essential prerequisite for any legitimate claim to the throne. This dynamic was evident during the so-called Year of the Four Emperors Gast in 69 after Christ, when following the death of Nero Samo, four generals, Galba, Datko, Otho, Dabo, Vitellius, Shaubu, and for Vespasian, vied for power, each supported by different legions. The victory of Vespasian, with the decisive support of the Eastern legions, consolidated the perception that the imperial throne was not merely a political office, but a military magistracy, whose holder needed to secure the troops' backing to legitimize and maintain his power. In the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ, during the so-called crisis period of the empire, the relationship between the legions and imperial power reached its most unstable peak. Political fragmentation, pressures on the frontiers, and the decay of civil institutions transformed the empire into a stage of constant military usurpations. Provincial generals were often proclaimed emperors by their troops, the so-called soldier emperors, precipitating devastating civil wars that eroded the empire's unity and stability. Among the most significant examples of this phenomenon was the rise of John Septimius Severus in 193 after Christ, who, supported by the legions of the Pannonia and the Danube, marched on Rome and overthrew his rivals, inaugurating a new dynasty. In a symbolic and strategic move, Severus profoundly reformed the military structure, increasing legionaries' pay, formally allowing married soldiers to serve, and expanding citizenship grants to auxiliaries, strengthening the bond between the legions and imperial power. The process culminated with the total militarization of the empire under 3rd century emperors, such as Maximian, Galerius, and Diocletian, who reorganized the army, created new mobile units, the comitatenses, and divided imperial authority among several co-emperors in the so-called tetrarchy, an attempt to control the centrifugal forces unleashed by the autonomous power of the legions. This close symbiosis between the legions and imperial power, although at times ensuring the empire's stability and continuity, also generated cycles of political violence, usurpations, and civil wars that, over the centuries, undermined the foundations of Roman power and accelerated its decline, especially in the West. Nevertheless, the positive role of this relationship cannot be underestimated. By serving as instruments of access and maintenance of the throne, the legions also ensured the protection of the frontiers, the implementation of imperial policies, and the diffusion of Roman culture throughout the empire. Their loyalty, though volatile, was essential for the Roman state's survival and the continuity of the imperial tradition. Thus, the legions were more than soldiers. They became central political actors, shaping the empire's course, deciding successions, and in many cases, determining who ruled Rome. The history of Roman imperial power, in both its grandeur and its decline, is therefore inseparable from the history of the legions. The same troops who, in the words of Tacitus, preferred to make emperors rather than obey them. The Roman legion, beyond being a formidable military and political machine, was also a space deeply marked by religiosity, collective rites, and superstitions that permeated the lives of legionaries from the moment of their enlistment to their final moments on the battlefield. Religion in the legions was not merely a personal expression of faith, but an institutionalized practice, integrated into military discipline and conceived as an essential element to ensure the cohesion, motivation, and spiritual protection of the troops. From the earliest times of the Republic, each legion marched under the protection and favor of Ains, Rome's tutelary gods, especially Jupiter Optimus Maximus, lord of the skies and patron of military victory, and Mars, god of war and mythical father of the Roman people. Veneration of Mars was central. Before each campaign, solemn rituals were performed in his temples with animal sacrifices and prayers, invoking his strength and benevolence to lead the legions to victory. Soldiers believed that without divine approval, no march was safe and no battle could be won. Within the very legionary camp, religious presence was constant and visible. Each legion maintained a portable altar, and regularly held religious ceremonies, especially before marches and battles. The auspicia, practices of interpreting divine signs, were conducted by military priests or by the commander himself, who would examine the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals to determine whether the gods favored the mission. An unfavorable omen could postpone a battle or alter tactical plans, such was the importance attached to divine signs. Alongside official cults, more personal and diverse religious practices flourished, reflecting the cultural heterogeneity of the legions, composed of soldiers from various regions of the empire. This religious pluralism favored the spread of Eastern and mystery cults among the legionaries, the most emblematic being Mithraism, a Persian-origin cult venerating Mithras, a deity associated with light, strength, and victory over darkness. Mithraism offered an initiatory structure and an ethic of fraternity and courage that resonated deeply with the military ethos, becoming extremely popular among soldiers, especially on the frontiers and in distant garrisons. Mithric ceremonies were conducted in secret environments, the Mithraea, often built near camps or within frontier cities, where legionaries would perform initiation rituals, sacred banquets, and reenactments of the central myth of Mithras defeating the primordial bull, a symbol of the triumph of order over chaos. Adherence to this cult provided soldiers with a sense of belonging and additional spiritual security in the face of military life's dangers. Besides Mithras, other Eastern cults also gained adherents among legionaries, such as those of Isis and Ha-Cybele, whose practices involved purification rituals, music, dance, and sometimes ecstatic states that offered comfort and hope to soldiers constantly confronted with the threat of death. However, religiosity in the legions was not limited to major cults or public rites. Soldiers' daily lives were permeated by countless superstitions and magical practices intended to ward off bad luck and attract divine protection. Amulets, talismans, magical formulas engraved on small lead tablets, the difficciones, were widely used to protect the bearer or curse enemies. Many legionaries carried phallic amulets, symbols of fertility and protection common in Roman popular religiosity. Death on the battlefield was surrounded by specific rituals. Comrades would bury the bodies whenever possible, with proper religious honors to ensure the peace of the spirit and prevent it from becoming a larva, or restless spirit, condemned to wander the world of the living. The fear of ghosts and the need to ensure a dignified funeral were deeply rooted in the legionaries' religious mindset. Commanders also resorted to collective purification rituals after particularly bloody battles, aiming to purge bad influences and restore the group's spiritual order. On these occasions, sacrifices, wine libations, and incense burnings in honor of the gods were performed, renewing the bond between soldiers and the divine and strengthening the troops' morale. With the advent of Christianity and its gradual penetration into the empire, the legions became the stage for significant religious tensions. Although the army, as an institution, initially resisted the new faith, its inexorable spread eventually reached the soldiers. From the 3rd century after Christ onwards, records emerge of Christian martyr legionaries who refused to participate in pagan rituals or sacrifice to the imperial gods, being persecuted or executed for this. One of the most famous cases is that of the Theban Legion, a unit composed mainly of Christians who, according to tradition, was decimated for refusing to renounce their faith. In the 4th century after Christ, with the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the officialization of Christianity, the religious landscape of the legions radically transformed. The ancient cults were progressively suppressed, Christian symbols began to adorn military standards, and new rituals, such as blessings of the troops by bishops, replaced pagan sacrifices. The religiosity of the legion, which for centuries had been marked by pluralism and pagan tradition, thus became an expression of the new spiritual power shaping the empire, Christianity. Nevertheless, the legacy of legionary religiosity survived in European military culture, inspiring practices, symbols, and rites that, in other forms, traversed the Middle Ages and reached modern armies. Devotion to the standard, solemn oaths of loyalty, farewell and consecration ceremonies still keep alive the memory of that ancestral link between the warrior and the sacred, forged in the immortal ranks of the Roman legion. Although the Roman legion was a predominantly male institution, shaped by ideals of virility, discipline, and martial camaraderie, women played a significant, albeit unofficial, role in the Roman military world. While laws and regulations formally prohibited the presence of women within the ranks and camps, in practice, the coexistence of soldiers and women was a constant reality, reflecting both the emotional and social needs of the legionaries and the complex dynamics of campaigns and Roman garrisons spread across the vast empire. From the earliest days of the Roman army, legal precepts forbade the presence of women within legionary camps. The prohibition aimed to preserve military discipline, prevent distractions, and avoid internal conflicts, ensuring that the legion remained a purely functional and operational force. Regulations also prohibited, until the reforms of Septimius Severus, at the end of the 2nd century after Christ, soldiers from entering into legal marriage during their active service, which often extended for 20 or more years. The idea was that the legionary should be, above all, a servant of the empire, without familial ties that might compromise his loyalty or limit his mobility. However, reality on the frontiers and during long campaigns proved much more flexible. Many women, unofficial wives, companions, prostitutes, merchants, and washerwomen, accompanied the legions, settling in the peripheries of the camps or in villages near military fortifications. These informal settlements, known as a canabe or vicus, became vibrant communities where civilians and military coexisted and where women played indispensable roles in the economy and daily life of the garrisons. The companions of soldiers, although deprived of legal recognition, formed de facto families, raising children and sharing life with their military partners. Many of these women were locals, belonging to the conquered populations or the provinces where the legions were stationed, establishing emotional and cultural ties that significantly facilitated the process of Romanization. The presence of these women and their families humanized military life, providing legionaries with emotional refuge amid the harshness of discipline and the constant imminence of death. Women also played crucial economic roles in military communities. Many worked as merchants, supplying food, clothing, utensils, and other essential goods for the soldiers' daily lives. Others engaged in activities such as washing, cooking, or healing, providing services that, although not formally recognized by the military hierarchy, were essential for the well-being and maintenance of the legion. Particularly important was the role of women as mothers and educators of soldiers' children, many of whom, upon reaching adulthood, joined the legions or other imperial services, perpetuating the family military tradition. Although the children born of these unions were initially not considered legitimate Roman citizens, over time, especially after the reforms of Caracalla in the 3rd century after Christ, which extended citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, these family ties came to be officially recognized, further promoting the integration of military communities into Roman civic structures. The formal restrictions on the presence of women in the legions were, to a large extent, softened over time. From the reign of Septimius Severus, soldiers were officially allowed to marry during active service, acknowledging a reality that had long been part of military life. This institutional change reflected both the need to ensure greater stability and cohesion in the garrisons and the understanding that the prohibition was, in practice, ineffective and counterproductive. Nevertheless, women were never officially incorporated as combatants. Among the Roman legions, unlike in some contemporary societies, such as certain barbarian tribes, where warrior women played an active role, Roman mentality regarding gender roles remained, in this respect, conservative, relegating women to emotional and logistical support roles, but not as direct participants in military campaigns. However, Roman literature and art occasionally evoked the figure of the sure female warrior, especially in descriptions of barbarian enemies, such as the Amazons, Beat, or the Celtic and Germanic warrior women, who faced Roman armies with bravery. These representations, often idealized or stigmatized, paradoxically reinforced the image of the Roman soldier as the defender of order and civilization against barbarism. Finally, it is important to emphasize that beyond their practical roles, the female presence in legionary contexts helped shape Roman military culture itself, softening its most brutal aspects and promoting forms of sociability, solidarity, and identity that transcended the rigidity of disciplinary norms. Women, even on the margins of official recognition, were indispensable companions in the epic of the Legion, silently participating in the construction and maintenance of the Roman Empire. Thus, although excluded from the formal ranks, women were always present, at the rear, in the camps, in the markets, in homes, and in the hearts of legionaries, exerting a profound and lasting influence on the Roman military world, which cannot be fully understood without recognizing this silent but decisive protagonism. The Roman legion left its mark not only on the battlefields or on the stones of fortifications scattered across the edges of the empire, but also immortalized itself in literature and art, which perpetuated its image as a symbol of discipline, power, and civilization. From historical accounts to triumphal monuments, through sculptures, paintings, and inscriptions, the imaginary of the legion was carefully forged and transmitted, not only as a testimony of military feats, but as a visual and narrative expression of Rome's grandeur and its imperial vocation. In Atzur literature, the legion was celebrated, analyzed, and immortalized by some of Antiquity's greatest writers. The most famous among them was undoubtedly Gaius Julius Caesar, whose work, De Bello Gallico, constitutes not only a military account of the Gallic campaigns, but also a literary and political monument that elevates the legion to the status of heroic protagonist. By narrating with strategic precision and rhetorical elegance the movements of the legions, their victories, their hardships, and the ingenuity of their engineers and commanders, Caesar not only constructed his own glory, but also consolidated, in the Roman and universal imagination, the image of the legion as an almost invincible force, guided by reason and discipline. Other historians such as Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio also recorded the trajectory of the legions from the early Republic to the imperial campaigns. In their narratives, the legion appears both as an instrument of imperial expansion and as a central element in Rome's political crises and transformations. In Tacitus, for example, we see the vivid portrait of legions involved in the Germanic wars and political convulsions, while Suetonius details the episodes in which the legions made and unmade emperors, such as during the tumultuous year of the Four Emperors. In epic poetry, the legions also find a place as symbols of Rome's civilizing mission. In the poem Aeneid, by Virgil, although the plot is set in a mythical past preceding the foundation of Rome, there is a clear anticipation of Roman military glory, with the prophetic promise that the descendants of Aeneas, the Romans, would be masters of war and rulers of the world. This glorious destiny, sustained by the legions, is presented as part of the fatum, the inevitable fate that legitimizes and exalts the imperial mission. In the field of monumental art, the presence of the legion is equally striking and expressive. Among the most emblematic testimonies stands the Column of Trajan, erected in Rome to celebrate Emperor Trajan's victories in the Dacian Wars at the beginning of the 2nd century after Christ. About 30 meters high, the column is covered by a continuous helical frieze that narrates in impressive detail the military campaigns, from river crossings to battles, sieges, and moments of fortification construction. The legions appear as central figures, displaying the precision of their formations, the ingenuity of their war machines, and the discipline in executing each task. This monument is not only a celebration of military victories, but also a powerful visual expression of imperial ideology, the legion as the armed arm of Rome, bearer of civilization and order over barbarian peoples. The Column of Trajan thus synthesizes the aesthetic, political, and memorial function of Roman imperial art. Other examples abound. The cute triumphal arches, such as that of Titus Ius or Septimius Severus, depict in their reliefs the legions on the march, carrying spoils or leading prisoners, eternalizing Rome's military superiority and conquest capacity. On imperial coins, it was common to depict legionary standards, eagles and legionaries in martial postures, symbols that circulated throughout the empire, reinforcing in daily economic and political life the symbolic presence of the legions. In epigraphic inscriptions, thousands of stones scattered throughout the provinces attest to the presence of the legions, recording not only the works they carried out, bridges, aqueducts, walls, but also individual tributes to soldiers and officers, moving epitaphs and declarations of honor and loyalty to the emperor and to Rome. These records constitute an invaluable documentary heritage, allowing for precise reconstruction of the legion's routes, their feats, and the composition of their units. The presence of the legion in Roman art and literature, however, was not limited to praise and glorification. At times, critical or melancholic records emerge, reflecting Roman awareness of the human cost of war and the brutality that inevitably accompanied military campaigns. In Tacitus' writings, for example, we find a bitter reflection on the destruction wrought by the legions and on the moral limits of imperial expansion. With the advent of Sauer's Christianity and the cultural transformation of the empire, the image of the legion underwent an inflection. If previously it represented Rome's glory and strength, it gradually came to be associated with instruments of religious persecution, as in the accounts of soldier martyrs, while at the same time being symbolically reinterpreted as a model of order and discipline applicable to the new spiritual militia of Christian believers. Thus, the Roman legion transcended its immediate historical function and became a lasting symbol, inscribed in humanity's collective imagination as a metaphor for disciplined strength, rational order, and imperial power. Roman literature and art perpetuated this image, transmitting to future generations not only the testimony of Rome's military conquests, but also the complex web of meanings and values that the legion embodied: courage, discipline, ingenuity, and at times, brutality. The power of the Roman legion, which for centuries ensured the expansion, stability, and hegemony of the empire, began to undergo a gradual process of decline and transformation. From the late 2nd century after Christ, intensifying throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, in a period historically known as the Late Empire c. This phenomenon did not occur suddenly or uniformly, but resulted from a complex interaction of military, political, economic, and social factors that combined undermined the pillars of the military institution that had once sustained the Roman world. The first decisive element of this decline was the crisis of the 3rd century after Christ, a phase of profound instability marked by massive barbarian invasions, frequent civil wars, and widespread economic collapse. The legions, which until then had been the backbone of imperial power, found themselves overextended and scattered, forced to face multiple enemies simultaneously on different fronts: the Germanic and Sarmatian peoples to the north, the Parthians, and later the Sassanid Persians to the east, in addition to internal revolts and usurpers proclaimed by rival military factions. The growing military pressure revealed the weaknesses of the traditional legion model, structured for long and organized campaigns, but ill-prepared to deal with the fast and unpredictable incursions of new enemies such as the Goths, Vandals, and Huns, whose mobility and aggression challenged the rigidity of classic legionary formations. Faced with this scenario, it became necessary to rethink and reform the Roman military apparatus. The most significant reforms occurred under Emperor Diocletian, reigned 284–305 after Christ, and later under Constantine the Great, reigned 306–337 after Christ. Diocletian, facing the need to defend increasingly vulnerable frontiers, implemented a profound reorganization of the armed forces, which included the creation of two distinct types of troops, the Limitani and the Comitatenses. The Limitani, or border troops, were military units permanently stationed along the Limes, tasked with constant patrols, protecting fortifications, and delaying enemy incursions. Although essential for the defense of the empire, these soldiers were often locally recruited, poorly paid, and inadequately trained, representing a dilution of the legion's former standards of excellence. On the other hand, the Sulti Comitatenses constituted mobile forces, organized into smaller and more agile units, capable of moving quickly to face emerging threats anywhere in the empire. This innovation responded to the need for strategic flexibility, but also marked the end of the classic legion model, replaced by less standardized and more diverse units. Another significant transformation was the progressive inclusion of barbarian soldiers in the Roman ranks, a phenomenon that, although not entirely unprecedented, barbarian auxiliaries had long served alongside the legions, acquired unprecedented proportions in the late empire. Due to the declining Roman population fit for military service and the growing difficulty in recruiting citizens for the army, emperors began to grant land and citizenship to barbarian chieftains in exchange for their military loyalty. Thus, entire tribes such as the Goths, Franks, and Vandals were incorporated as federates, foederati, fighting sometimes as allies, sometimes as adversaries. This barbarization of the troops, while necessary for the empire's military survival, profoundly altered the character and cohesion of the Roman armed forces. The traditional legionary ethos, based on discipline, loyalty to the emperor, and Roman citizenship, was gradually replaced by contractual relationships and a cultural and ethnic fragmentation that hampered the army's unity and effectiveness. The decline of the legion was also accompanied by a crisis in imperial authority. Imperial succession became increasingly dependent on military support, generating cycles of coups, usurpations, and civil wars that further weakened the empire's defensive structures. Emperors such as Aurelian, Probus, and Julian, although competent, spent much of their reigns suppressing internal revolts or fighting invaders, leaving the legions constantly exhausted and fragmented. On a technical and tactical level, the legion underwent a process of simplification. The complex system of cohorts and centuries gave way to smaller and less homogeneous units, while the traditional close formations were partly abandoned in favor of more flexible tactics suited to new types of confrontation. The famous lorica segmentata, the emblematic armor of the classic legionary, fell into disuse, replaced by lighter chainmail or even leather protections, more suitable for mobility and cheaper to produce. Despite these changes and the apparent decline, it is important to recognize that the Roman army of the late empire was not simply a decadent force, but an institution in transformation, seeking to adapt to a changing world marked by new threats and challenges. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, for almost 1,000 years after the fall of the West, is testimony to the effectiveness of these reforms and the Roman military tradition's capacity for reinvention. The formal end of the classical legions occurred in the West with the deposition of the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in the year 476 after Christ, an event that symbolizes the disintegration of imperial authority and the armed forces' inability to preserve Rome's territorial and political integrity. However, the legionary legacy survived in the military institutions of the barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the empire's ruins, and, even more so, in the Byzantine military structures, which preserved in other forms the Roman organizational tradition and strategic doctrine. Thus, the decline of the Roman legion should not be understood merely as a fall but as a metamorphosis, marked by losses but also by innovations that allowed the continuation of the Roman military tradition in new political and cultural configurations. The legion disappeared as an institution, but its influence remained alive, perpetuating itself as a model of military organization, a symbol of discipline and efficiency, and an indelible legacy in the history of warfare and Western civilization. The end of the Roman legions, as a classical institution, is closely associated with the collapse of the Pico Western Roman Empire, a gradual and multifaceted process that culminated in the symbolic deposition of Romulus Augustulus in the year 476 after Christ by the barbarian chieftain Antiochus. However, the extinction of the Western legions did not mean the complete disappearance of the Roman military legacy. On the contrary, while the West plunged into political and territorial fragmentation, the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, not only survived but perpetuated, transformed, and refined the military traditions inherited from Rome, ensuring the continuity of its essence for nearly another 1,000 years. In the West, the disintegration of the legions resulted from a convergence of factors: the collapse of the frontiers, the increasing dependence on barbarian troops, the economic failure that made regular payment of soldiers impossible, and, above all, the dissolution of imperial authority, increasingly incapable of effectively commanding or coordinating its military forces. The legions, which for centuries had been the bulwark of Rome's security and expansion, found themselves weakened, dispersed, and, in many cases, simply absorbed by the invading peoples who settled in the former imperial provinces. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged in western territories, such as the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Hispania, the Franks in Gaul, and the Vandals in North Africa, incorporated to varying degrees elements of Roman military traditions. Many Roman soldiers and commanders came to serve under new banners, and the administrative and military structures that had sustained the legions were, in part, adapted to the realities of the new local powers. Thus, although the legions as an institutional unit disappeared in the West, their organizational model and martial culture survived and profoundly influenced the formation of medieval European armies. In contrast, in the Eastern Roman Empire, based with its capital in Constantinople, the Roman military legacy was not only preserved, but also vigorously and creatively developed. The Byzantine army, although different in composition, tactics, and doctrine, was a direct heir of the Roman legions, sustained by the same conception of a disciplined professional military power in service of the state. The reforms initiated in the late empire were perfected by the Byzantine emperors. The traditional legions gave way to new military units, such as the tagmata, elite troops stationed in the capital, and the themes and territorial defense systems that integrated civilian and military forces to protect the provinces. Although names and structures were distinct, the essence of the Roman model, the integration between strategy, administration, and military power, remained intact. Continuity is particularly evident in the military and strategic works produced by the Byzantines, such as the Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurice at the end of the 6th century after Christ, which systematized tactical, logistical, and organizational knowledge deeply rooted in the Roman legionary tradition. This military treatise, intended for the training of commanders, demonstrates the impressive longevity of Roman military concepts, adapted to new threats and technologies, such as heavy cavalry and sophisticated siege weapons. Moreover, the legionary symbolism was preserved and reinterpreted in the Eastern Empire. The labarum, kaisu, the Christian standard adopted by Constantine, progressively replaced the old pagan insignia, but the practice of marching under revered insignia, swearing oaths of loyalty, and considering the army as a guardian of order and civilization remained firm and unquestioned. Military ceremonies, solemn oaths, and rigid hierarchy continued to be distinctive marks of Byzantine military culture. The obstinate resistance of the Byzantine Empire against centuries of invasions and wars, facing Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, Slavs, and later Turks, was proof of the vitality and adaptability of the Roman military heritage. Although Constantinople fell only in 1453 to the Ottomans, the Roman military spirit had already remarkably survived for 1,000 years after the collapse of the West, projecting itself as one of Antiquity's most enduring legacies. The end of the legions canal, therefore, was not an absolute disappearance but a historical transmutation, from a classical imperial institution to an inexhaustible source of models, practices, and values that crossed late antiquity, nourished the medieval period, and continue in diffuse ways to inspire the modern military world. The figure of the disciplined soldier, loyal to the state and the mission, who fights not only for victory but for the preservation of an order and civilization, is a direct inheritance of the Roman legion that still resonates today. Thus, the twilight of the legions in the West did not signify the end of Rome, but the beginning of a new phase in its history, in which memory, tradition, and military practice continued to be transmitted, reinterpreted, and admired, keeping alive, through the centuries, the relentless march of the Roman legion in the imagination and culture of the Western world. Although the Roman legions disappeared as a formal institution more than 1,500 years ago, their military, organizational, and symbolic legacy remains deeply rooted in the armed forces and strategic conceptions of modern nations. Few historical institutions have exerted such an extensive and lasting influence as the Roman legion, whose model of discipline, hierarchy, professionalization, and integration between military power and state administration shaped not only the armies that succeeded it, but also the very Western idea of armed force. The first and most evident aspect of this legacy is the conception of military discipline as an essential foundation for the effectiveness of an army. The Roman legion was the first military force of antiquity to institute a meticulous regime of discipline based on strict obedience, constant training, and the absolute subordination of the soldier to the chain of command. This vision, that strength lies not only in individual bravery but in collective discipline, became the cornerstone of the professional armies that emerged in the modern age, such as those of Frederick the Great, of Prussia, or Napoleon Bonaparte, both deeply inspired by the organizational efficiency of the Roman legions. The very hierarchical structure of the legions, with their centuries, cohorts, and legions integrated into a clear and efficient chain of command, anticipated the model of organization in standardized units that characterizes contemporary armed forces. Terms such as century, cohort, or a legion continue to be used both formally and informally to designate military units or to evoke the tradition of cohesion and discipline associated with the Roman army. The standardization of training, weapons, and equipment, which the legions elevated to an unprecedented level in antiquity, became, from the 17th century onward, a norm in European and, subsequently, global armed forces. Another crucial aspect is the concept of polyprofessionalization of the soldier, systematically developed in the legions following the reforms of Tutamu Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century before Christ. The idea of a permanent army, made up of soldiers who dedicate their lives to military service in exchange for salary, benefits, and status, was a Roman innovation that deeply inspired the formation of modern professional armies, breaking with the medieval model of temporary and irregular armies based on feudal levies. The legionary tradition also influenced the notion of integration between military force and state power. For Rome, the legion was not only a combat unit but an extension of the state itself, an instrument of both conquest and administration. This principle guided the formation of modern empires, such as the coup to British and of French empires, which, like Rome, used their armed forces not only to wage war, but also to found cities, build infrastructures, establish legal systems, and spread cultural values, just as the legions did when consolidating the process of Romanization in conquered provinces. Military engineering also finds deep roots in the legionary tradition. The Roman soldier was not only a combatant, but also a builder, erecting camps, fortifications, roads, bridges, and aqueducts, using standardized techniques and methods that ensured efficiency and durability. This model was widely emulated in the formation of military engineering corps, such as those of the British Army or the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which combine military competence with technical and constructive skills. On a symbolic level, modern military iconography frequently resorts to the emblems and insignia of the Roman legion to evoke tradition, strength, and prestige. The eagle, the highest symbol of the legions, continues to be an emblem present on many flags, coats of arms, and military standards, such as those of Russia, the Geek United States, or Nash Germany, all evoking directly or indirectly the majesty and power associated with the legionary standard. The very concept of the standard as an object of veneration, to be defended to the death, is a tradition that dates back to the Roman legions, for whom the loss of an eagle was considered an unforgivable dishonor. Moreover, the conception of military doctrine as a body of systematized knowledge guiding the formation, organization, and employment of armed forces traces back to Roman strategic and tactical treatises, such as the works of Vegetius, especially Epitoma Rei Militaris, which influenced European military thought up to the modern age. This treatise, compiling the lessons of Roman military experience, was required reading for medieval and Renaissance commanders, serving as a manual for the organization and training of troops. Finally, the idea of military force as a civilizational element, capable of bringing values, laws, and institutions to conquered territories, finds in the legionary model its highest expression. The modern conception of quintile peacekeeping missions, humanitarian interventions, and stabilization operations often relies on the notion, forged in Roman experience, that military power can and should be used not only to destroy, but also to build and organize. Thus, the legacy of the Roman legion is much more than a historical memory. It is a living presence in the way modern states conceive, organize, and project their military power. The discipline, hierarchy, professionalization, engineering, strategy, and military symbolism that defined the legion continue to shape the armies of the contemporary world, perpetuating, in new forms, the eternal march of Rome's legions. Under the relentless sun of the Asian steppes, in the frozen mists of the Germanic forests, or beneath the scorching sands of the African desert, marched for centuries the steady and indomitable rhythm of the Roman legion. More than a military force, it was the living embodiment of the spirit of Rome, a concrete projection of its will to power, its rational order, and its universalist vocation. The legion did not merely fight and conquer, it built, organized, and bequeathed. In every road laid, every bridge erected, every city founded, pulsed the martial soul of Rome, a soul that, though its soldiers have long since fallen, never truly knew death. The Roman legion was at once a rigorously disciplined organism and a spiritual entity. Its soldiers, arranged in perfect formations, armed with courage and discipline, represented the organized force that transformed a small city-state into the greatest empire of antiquity. But beyond the gleaming helmets, the raised spears, and the banners fluttering in the wind, there was an idea that human order could impose itself upon the chaos of the world, that reason could subdue barbarism, and that Rome was not just a place, but an inescapable destiny. Each legion carried with it the weight of tradition and the burden of glory, aware that its march was not only for victory, but for eternity. When a legionary drove the tip of his spade into the ground to erect yet another castrum, when he hurled the pilum at an enemy, or when he knelt to honor the eagle of his unit, he reaffirmed that invisible bond connecting him to past and future generations, a continuous thread that stitched together Roman history through its conquests, its ruins, and its monuments. Even in its fall, the legion retained its dignity and grandeur. In the death throes of the Western Empire, surrounded by invaders and betrayed by weak emperors, the legions fought to the end, sustaining with their blood spilled on unguarded frontiers the last vestiges of a civilization that, though about to fragment politically, would forever endure as a model, a myth and an inescapable reference of Western history. The immortality of the legion is found not only in the texts of ancient historians, in the columns raised in honor of imperial victories, or in the abandoned fortresses that dot the map of Europe and the Mediterranean. It resides above all in the way it shaped the institutions, values, and practices that have traversed the centuries. In the concept of military discipline, in the engineering applied to conquest, in the idea that war can be an instrument of civilization and, paradoxically, of peace, the legionary soul survives. In every modern army that marches beneath standards, in every commander who leads his troops following codes of honor and strategy, there is a reflection, sometimes unconscious, of that ancestral tradition forged on the battlefields of the ancient world.